Of the tribal, on behalf of the Tribal Youth Resource Center, we would like to welcome you to today's presentation, The History of Indian Education and Its Impact on Our Youth and Development. Before we begin, we would like to do a land acknowledgement. Next slide. We come to you today, the presenters, the panelists, from the homelands of the Kittikitis, Wichita, Koigu, Kiowa, Numina, Comanche, Apache, Kickapoo, Osage nations, known today as present-day El Reno and Anadarko, Oklahoma. Next slide, please. The Tribal Youth Resource Center has a vision of where Indigenous youth can thrive through traditional ways of life. Also, our purpose is to enhance opportunities for Indigenous communities to expand their potential and protecting and nurturing their most sacred asset, the youth. Next slide. So I would like to introduce myself. My name is Deidra Flurry. I am a training and technical assistant specialist with the Tribal Youth Resource Center. I would also like to introduce the co-facilitator today, Ms. Amber Silverhorn-Wolfe. She is a consultant with the Tribal Youth Resource Center. Next slide. Today, I am pleased to announce our panelists. They bring a wealth of knowledge in their fields. We have Ms. Donna Ritchie, Tribal Services Director for Communities and Schools of Mid-America. We have Ms. Tasia Zintak, Director of Education for Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And we have Ms. Chelsea Duro, the SAMHSA Grant Administrator for the Wichita and affiliated tribes. Next slide. Today, we will go over the overview of the impact of state and federal education policies on Native people and communities, generational trauma and its impact on student success and family engagement. And our third objective will be strategies for building effective relationships with communities, tribal nations, and K-12 schools for healthier student outcomes. Next slide, please.
All right. So, as Deidra mentioned, I'm just going to share just a little bit about this video. Matika Wilbur, she runs a nonprofit organization called Project 562, where she's been around the United States, visiting over 40 states and over 300 sovereign nation members. And with that, she brings a wealth of diversity. And before we go into this topic today, we wanted to have student voices shared for us bringing Kennedy in to, do our opening. We also wanted to share this video to keep in mind the students that we are serving whenever we talk about Indian education and improving it and making ways for them for their future. So just wanted to share on that. And if you could just play the video.
It kind of sucks. It's kind of like playing dodgeball, but getting hit every single time.
All they teach us in school basically is who they were, where they lived, how they were killed, and how we stole land from the white people, basically.
Administration is definitely a bit harsher on certain races.
Teachers assume a lot about us, and they assume that we're druggies or we're alcoholics.
That I'm like a thug or something, and I'm not.
When I do say I'm Native American, the substitute teachers or teachers, they always ask about per capita checks.
You shouldn't be here, go back to your land, go back home. It's kind of stupid because this is our land.
But it's just the people that make you suffer to go into school. Our teachers, they don't really help us with bullying.
It makes your self-esteem so low to where you feel like you don't even want to get up and go to school.
I think representation is very important, and seeing people who look like us in positions that matter.
The school system should educate more. Just say, hey, Native Americans are still alive. Don't be mean to them, and here's a few facts about them.
We're just more than natives. You know, we're more than that. We're people. We have the same emotions, we have the same fights and stuff that you're probably going through, and like, we have to go through the same thing.
If we really are able to understand that we are Native people and we are all one, and we have to lift each other up.
Music.
I want to be a cosmetologist.
I want to become an actress, but I don't see a lot of Native American actresses.
Want to help out with my family when I get older.
I want to become the first Native American male model to be known.
I just want to see more.
Basketball every day would be my dream to have a full scholarship.
I really just want to learn. I want to see where it takes me. I want to be able to help other people. And of course, I always want to be able to come back to where I came from and celebrate and honor that with other people.
Thank you. Next slide, Antonio. Before we go into a little bit further, we definitely, we're bringing this to you as an educational event, and we know that you have questions. If you do have questions for any of the facilitators or the panelists, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. That will be pulled specifically for questions, and you will get an opportunity to ask questions later in the presentation as well. On to our first objectives. We're going to be discussing a brief overview of events, laws, and policy that made an impact on K-12 Indian education. A lot of these events are historical events, and many of us know about them. Next slide. But they all have made an impact on the education of Indigenous youth. Of course, we'll start with 1492, Christopher Columbus's land on the Americas. How that made a negative impact is, of course, the enslavement and seizure of Native properties. Of course, the abuse, the mistreatment on young Indigenous people began at that time. By the European influence. Also, in 1516, the Spanish monarchy created an office called the Protector of the Indians. And what that actually did was it said that Indigenous people had the capacity to comprehend Catholicism, which means they were capable of participating in Catholicism. So, which meant in less than 100 years, missions across the United States were formed. This stretched from Florida to New Mexico, and then shortly the western part of the United States. Or next slide. Then on to Manifest Destiny, the Indian Removal Act. This took away the large land masses that different tribal nations occupied west of the Mississippi River, and instead were given them allotments of small properties, which was not a usual thing for Native peoples. Land ownership was unfamiliar. They used the land, they moved with the land, they moved with animals. So this was a new concept. Of course, Western culture had the idea of manifest destiny, which meant that it was God's will that they developed the land in God's image, and it was just a contrast in personal beliefs. So on to the time of 1879. I do apologize. I'm trying to look down at the chat box as well and read all the wonderful comments coming in. From 1879 to 1930, the U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs adopted boarding schools. Boarding schools were designed for children ages 3 to be removed from their homes and put in these schools. They were to stay there. Sometimes these schools were hundreds of miles away from the town. Of course, many of us are aware of the travesties that happened at boarding schools. A little about them, they were just poorly managed. They were underfunded, poorly managed. The staff lacked the knowledge. They were overcrowded. They didn't have enough food for the youth. There has been reports of physical and sexual abuse among the people who are supposed to be the caregivers of the children. There was widespread diseases. Now, one note that the first boarding school created was Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was founded by Richard Henry Pratt. Richard Henry Pratt modeled boarding schools off of a prison, actually. He modeled it off of the Fort Marion prison in St. Augustine, Florida. And that's where he began Native assimilation. And so he thought he could use that and start with the youth. Of course, Richard Henry Pratt coined his philosophy of assimilation. Many of us have heard it, kill the Indian, save the man. Of course, it's actually a much broader concept that he shared. It had to do with, he did side with the general who said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And so that's the most disturbing part of the boarding school era, that the father of boarding schools was someone who had this really disturbing consideration for Native peoples. And just so you know that we are recording this presentation, and everything will be available to all those who attend and want to go back and review. Next slide, please. In 1829, I guess a little bit of light came about. We had a non-political study published, and it was titled "The Problem of Indian Administration." It's also known as the Union Report. And this study was conducted on the conditions of boarding schools. They found that they of course lacked the appropriate training from the service employees. There was poor food quality. One study found that 2 times a day, these children were given bread, white bread, and coffee for their meals. Of course, they couldn't afford milk for the children, so there was just very inadequate nutrition. It also found that boarding schools were inappropriate for elementary age children, and it said that they would be more beneficial with increasing the number of day schools. So, they recommended to, instead of continuing this on, the new goal should be protect the American Indian students, their homelands, and their resources. So now we're starting to see some positive changes. Of course, Not everybody is on board, but we are still seeing some positive changes in Indian education history, which is now can be seen today. In 1934, the Johnson-O'Malley Act allowed the Secretary of the Interior to enter into contracts with states, individual states, to educate Indian students. So throughout the public schools, they were given a set amount of money to educate Indian students. However, in many cases, the Native students continue to face resistance, racial resistance as well. Also, sometimes the funding, and even present day, unfortunately, sometimes the funding that went to the schools went to the general fund and sometimes did not go towards the American Indian students. Next slide, please. In 1972, the Indian Education Act was passed, which was meant to empower parents and provide student funding for programs to enrich their education. The Indian Education Act also established the Office of Indian Education and the National Advisory Council for Indian Education. Now this is present day, and provides federal funds for American Indian and Alaskan Native education at all levels. This funding is used to supplement programs to help manage the special needs for Indian students, provide culturally relevant enrichment education, and to promote bilingual curricula. As I said, this information can be found within the Every Student Succeeds Act. It's called ESSA. It's Title VI, Part A. If any of you are interested, of course, this is funding currently that public schools get for American Indian students. So if you want to learn up on that, you can find that under the ESSA Act. And to add on to that was the Esther Martinez Native American Language Preservation Act. This is an education policy that overturned centuries of systemic, linguistic, and cultural repression. And it's created to provide funding for communities, schools, and language revitalization programs. So combined, now you start to see language incorporated in the public schools, language being offered as a second language, tribal languages being offered as a tribal language, as a world language. Next slide. Okay, now at this time, we would like to bring on our panelists. And we just have a few questions because you bring specific expertise, and we just want to get your thoughts, your opinions, your perspectives. And I would like to start with Tasia. Ms. Tasia Thintak is the Education Director for the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Tasia, can you share your perspective on historical impacts of colonization as it relates to Indian education?
Absolutely. Miigwech, thank you all for having me here. There are myriad of ways that that colonization has affected Indian education, but one of the major ways that educational spaces need to be aware of and programs need to be aware of is a general mistrust of educational institutions by a lot of Indigenous families. I should give a caveat here that as we know, there are over 570 tribal nations in the United States. So when I'm speaking here, I'm speaking a little bit in generalizations, but I cannot speak for all Indigenous people. I couldn't even speak for all Potawatomi if I wanted to. So I just want to give that caveat. But generally, there can be a mistrust of educational institutions by Indigenous families because of those historical happenings that Deidra just covered. So thinking about boarding schools and how absolutely horrific those were for families, thinking about the loss of language and culture that happened there, that have so many tribes, including my own, fighting to regain a connection to our language and culture after so much was lost, thinking about the removals and how that, here where I am in Oklahoma, and where others on this call are as well, we have 39 tribal nations, most of whom did not originate here. My tribe is from the Great Lakes area, so we are not only disconnected from a lot of our language and culture because of our educational history, but also we are literally disconnected from our homelands because we were forcibly removed here. And that causes a lot of identity issues for our tribal students. And I think it's really, really incredibly important that everyone, I was going to say every educator, but that everyone understands that every Indigenous person has a different relationship with their identity through no fault of their own. Those historical pressures that we just discussed, you don't know what their family effects might have been. So they may or may not know their language. They may or may not know their culture. They may or may not look the way that many people often think that Indigenous people look. And you can even look at this call, and not all of us look the same. So we can't assume that our students are going to look the same as Indigenous people either. But they're often told, or they've often expressed, a lot of our students expressed to us that they don't feel Native enough because they are not, they do not look or act a certain way. So it's incredibly important as educators and just as people in general that we create spaces that are welcoming and open and provide an opportunity for Indigenous people to learn. But those are just some of the impacts. There are many more impacts from some of the horrible things that happened in history, but those are just a few to focus on today. Thank you much.
Thank you for that response, Deidra. I did see in the chat box, and this is true. English is a foreign language, but we, just to have that opportunity to have our languages, our Indigenous languages, being taught within school is a great win, even if we have to call it world language. Any of our panelists, would they like to comment on the question before I move on? Okay, so in what ways and I'm going to direct this to Ms. Deidra as well, in what ways have education policies and efforts changed for the betterment of Indigenous youth?
Sure. So, of course, I'm a bit biased here because I'm coming from a tribal education department background, but I think tribal education departments and the growth, even in the past few years, has just been outstanding for our Native students. So, tribal education departments offer tribal scholarships, which takes off that financial pressure, or at least lessens that financial pressure for our Indigenous students. There's tribal specific curricula. So instead of, we fight the issue of there not being enough or any Native American content in our schools, but where there is, it's often pan-Indian versus being tribal specific. But I think with the rise of tribal education departments, you are seeing more resources available that are tribally specific, which is helping people understand the incredible diversity we have among and between tribal nations. You also have tribal colleges who are continuing those efforts on the post-secondary level. So they are really doing a wonderful job of welcoming Indigenous students and just creating a really indigenized and comfortable space for students. Title VI in Johnson O'Malley, I've heard so many people talk about how those have been lifesavers for them. That is a place where Indigenous students can find community with other Native students, with faculty or staff coordinators. And then it is a place where in the best of those types of programs, they have opportunities to connect with their culture in the school, which for some of them, as I mentioned earlier, maybe the first time they're connecting, and for the ones that it isn't, who have a strong, connection to their identity, then they're able to see that in the school space, and it's important for all students, no matter what their connection level. And then the final thing that I'll mention is tribal consultations. So with the authorization of ESSA, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but that connection, that ability for schools and tribal nations to connect and have conversations in a way that is just unprecedented has really allowed some incredible collaboration. So I think there are some bright spots to mention.
I definitely agree, especially that tribal consultation to really get that Indigenous voice and to speak for the tribe's youth. One more question, Deidra. In what ways have education policies and efforts changed that negative impact that is placed on Indigenous youth?
So a few ways that I think we're seeing some, maybe not fully reversal, but some at least positive change on some of those policies. One that I think I have to mention just this week, we've seen some efforts at the federal level related to boarding school truth. So I think just even the start of some acknowledgement of the atrocities that happened within boarding school, and that being brought to a federal stage, it's going to be extremely hard the next however long as these reports continue to come out. But I also think it's just incredibly important because for so long people just did not know what had happened, and maybe could not understand the generational trauma that was related to boarding school. So I think efforts of like the National Native American NABS, the Boarding School Coalition, I forget their full acronym, but the efforts of NABS to advocate on the federal and of course of Secretary Deb Haaland, we're seeing some good efforts happening there that are, I think, starting a conversation around boarding schools where it wasn't happening before, and maybe changing it to be more serious. Also, just so many efforts to regain culture and language or just promote them. An elder told us recently that our languages for the at least for most nations aren't dead. So we are reinvigorating those languages. We're not revitalizing, we're reinvigorating. We are bringing life to them, but we are not reviving them or bringing them back to life. But it's got, for our nation, we have fewer than 10 first language speakers. So to see tribal language departments happening, to see language being taught in the schools, we have Potawatomi taught in 4 schools here in Oklahoma and 4 high schools here in Oklahoma. We're working on getting it into 6 colleges. So things like that are really, really positive. And the fact that there are policies and laws that make that possible and welcomed is incredible. I also think representation has taken is taking a turn or is increasing in a positive way. So, I mean, shows like Reservation Dogs, Rutherford Falls, people are seeing themselves on screen. When we watched that video from Matika Wilbur, the students that were talking about wanting to be an actor or actress, like, that seems more possible than it even did 2 years ago, to me anyway. So I'm hoping that feels true for our students too. Elimination of some Native American mascots, still some ways to go there, but that kind of negative, harmful, incorrect representation hurts our students really badly. And so when that's removed, especially at the national level, that is huge to see those efforts happening, and I hope they continue. And then finally, I just think an overall movement towards self-governance. So this idea that tribes, can and should self-govern, which I laugh because tribes were doing that for so long pre-contact. So the fact that that it maybe is something even new from as recently as the 1970s is a little bit laughable, but I am glad that the federal government is supporting the idea that tribes can self-govern, and that ultimately, who better to take care of us than ourselves. So those are some ways that I think the policies are moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight. I do have one more question for you, Tasia. And this is a question that was posted in our chat box or in our Q&A box. Does the state dictate the actual curriculum in the schools, both public school systems and tribal school systems?
I don't know that I can speak necessarily for every state, but in Oklahoma, our curriculum is not dictated, but our standards are. So we have standards that then, educators have some, have leeway to decide how they want to teach to those standards. And there are, in Oklahoma, we have had an increase in the mention of tribal sovereignty. So there are standards within social studies that are related to removals, that are related to I think the earliest mention of sovereignty is in 3rd grade in our Oklahoma standards. So there are a lot of ways that Indigenous content is now included within the standards, but it is up to the educator to decide how to teach that. And so I think that the quality levels of how those are taught maybe differ by the educators and how comfortable they feel, which is why I think it is really important that tribal nations are providing curriculum, and that is becoming more and more available. You also have organizations like the National Indian Education Association, NIEA. Our Oklahoma State Department of Education has some resources as well. So you can see there are, and those are just a couple of resources. There are a lot more. The National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian, they have some resources online as well. There are a lot of places where you can find curriculum, but it's not necessarily dictated by the state or tribal school. Tribal school may be a little different, but for the state, it is standards. And so within that, it's up to the educator. And those are not even though it's more than it ever has been in Oklahoma, I will say that there's so much more to go. Indigenous content should not be relegated only to social studies, in my opinion. Social studies and history, which is often where it is. It's sort of like we were in the past, and here we are as an other cultural, versus celebrating our wonderful Indigenous writers in literature classes, or our wonderful Indigenous artists in art classes, our Indigenous scientists in science, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of room to grow there, but our standards, I think, are starting to reflect that. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, you did. And a lot of times it is the political climate of the state itself. I know we're having a few issues here in Oklahoma politically. I know a lot of the educators are limited to what they can say as far as history goes, to not upset certain groups of students. So it depends on the political climate. I know that there are some states like Montana, Idaho, that are actually incorporating American Indian history in the actual core curriculum. So it is being written in, and hopefully some of the other states will follow. But as Ms. Deidra said, it is the standards, whatever the standards of the State Department develop. So thank you so much, Ms. Deidra, for answering those questions. We'll also allow a little time for a few more questions to be asked to our panelists. Let's go ahead and move on to our next objective.
Okay, you can go to the next slide. So I did notice a question in the chat, and we'll address that after this objective. It was in relation to land acknowledgements. And I just wanted to ask and make sure that my audio is good. I know that when Deidra was on, there was some muffledness, and we did do a sound check, but sometimes things happen. So if I don't see any negative comments about the audio, I'm gonna go ahead and continue. Okay, great. So our next objective, we're looking at generational trauma. If some of you have heard it, it's referred to as intergenerational trauma as well. And it's historical trauma that gets passed on. Thinking about traumatic experiences that our ancestors had to go through, those things can be passed down, and there's been research and studies. So that's what we refer to when we talk about generational trauma within this segment. The term historical trauma was coined by Dr. Marcia Yellowhorse Braveheart, and her pictures there. And this was around the 1980s. And it was specifically in relation to the colonization, forced relocation, and assimilation of Native Americans. So we think about the historical points that Deidra just shared. All those things impacted our Native people. When we think about those boarding schools, the trauma that happened there to my grandmother, just thinking that it was only a couple generations away from me. And some grandparents, they're still living. So it wasn't that long ago. You might see these Black and white photos because it happened so long ago, but boarding schools are still impacting generations today. Could you go to the next slide, please? So in that respect, looking at generational trauma, according to the CDC, if you've ever heard of adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, they're potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. And they age between 0 and 17 years old when they refer to this. So examples can be experiencing violence, abuse, neglect, witnessing violence in the home or community, and having a family member attempt or die by suicide. So before we go on to the next slide, let me see. If you're there and you have a pen, just kind of go through this checklist. There's 10 categories. And I'm just going to ask a question. You don't have to answer in the chat. You don't have to answer out loud. You can just think in your head. But these are just some of the questions where you determine someone's ACE score, thinking about our youth. And these are some things that happen to give them a high score, which you know, it was referred to the ACEs. And with the higher score, you're going to have more trauma. So I'm gonna go ahead and just ask the question, give a couple of seconds to think about it, and then I'll go on to the next one and just calculate your score at the end, just for you, just to get some perspective in that. So the first question is, did you feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect or take care of you? So I'll ask that again. Did you feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect or take care of you? So if this was something that affected you, you can just note that down. I think it'll be on a score from like 1 to 10, right? So you can just put down a 1. But if it doesn't pertain to you, then we'll go to the next one. Did you lose a parent through divorce, abandonment, death, or another reason? And I'll ask that again. Did you lose a parent through divorce, abandonment, death, or another reason? If something like that has impacted you, then you would go ahead and write that score down as a 1. The next question is, did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? And I'll ask that again. Did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? The next question, did you live with anyone who had a problem with drinking or using drugs, including prescription drugs? And I'll ask that again. Did you live with anyone who had a problem with drinking or using drugs, including prescription drugs? Next question, did your parents or adults in your home ever hit, punch, beat, or threaten to harm each other? I'll ask that again. Did your parents or adults in your home ever hit, punch, beat, or threaten to harm each other? The next question is, did you live with anyone who went to jail or prison? So I'll ask that again. Did you live with anyone who went to jail or prison? The next question is, did a parent or adult in your home ever swear at you, insult you, or put you down? And I'll ask that again. Did a parent or adult in your home ever swear at you, insult you, or put you down? The next question, did a parent or adult in your home ever hit, beat, kick, or physically hurt you in any way? I'll ask that again. Did a parent or adult in your home ever hit, beat, kick, or physically hurt you in any way? The next question is, did you feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were special? And I'll ask that again. Did you feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were special? And the last question is, did you experience unwanted sexual contact? The last one is, did you experience unwanted sexual contact? And then that's where you would total up your responses. We asked 10 questions, so all of those, if they were a yes, you'd be at a 10, and so on and so forth. You would just add them up, and then on the sheet they ask you if you believe those experiences have affected your health. Because that's one thing with ACEs or with trauma. Some of these questions, I know they're hard for some of us who may have went through some of these things, especially as Native people, but they can affect health because of the way it impacts you and the things you may do to cover up that hurt, that pain, and try to navigate in a world that wasn't built to help us all the time, right? So, I mean, there have been advances, just how Deidra was talking about in education. Communities, tribal nations have incorporated programs that help in that respect to assist us in mental health, to assist us in our physical health, and to try to move things forward, right? So I just wanted to get that framework for you for, how we think about our youth, especially our troubled youth, the way that the history has impacted them even today. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So as we just mentioned, so your score, like looking at your score, if it's higher, some of these things are going to impact you. While it's up to, each individual person, because we're all made different. We grow up in different environments. Biologically, we're different. Just because they happen to you doesn't mean that these will happen to you. Thinking from my personal experience, my husband, he has never drank, he has never smoked, never done drugs, but on that trauma scale or that ACEs scale, he scores pretty high, but that's just an individual person. So we're not, of course, all the same. So just checking out the slide here, also included aspects of the child's environment that can undermine their sense of safety, stability, and bonding, such as growing up in a household with substance use problems, mental health problems, instability due to parental separation, or household members being in jail or in prison. So please note that the examples above are not a complete list of adverse experiences. Many other traumatic experiences could impact health and well-being. ACEs, when you score high, as we just mentioned, you're linked to chronic health problems, mental illnesses, substance abuse problems in adolescence and adulthood. ACEs can also negatively impact education, job opportunities, and earning potential. So that's why, we push for education for a lot of our students, but sometimes they can't just go in and learn like a regular, or what we define as normal, a normal student who has both parents there, who don't have to worry about eating, who don't have to worry about getting beat. So going into school, sometimes they're not fully there, I would say. So it's important to keep that in mind as we deal with our youth, deal with our Native youth, and thinking about that, their experiences, and who they are as people, and what has helped shape them to become who they are today. So let's go ahead to the next slide. All right, so this here, it's just a chart, it's like showing how generations can be affected by generational trauma. So we have our nation here, the political disempowerment, loss of collective identity, and genocide. So we look at those historical aspects that we talked about in the very first objective, of the land removal, of being removed from spaces where, you know, our ancestors lived, to having to come to a whole new area. I'm enrolled with the Wichita and affiliated tribes, and our land space covers, or used to cover, from Kansas through Oklahoma down into Texas. But now we're in a small space here in Anadarko, Oklahoma, that doesn't encompass as much land as it used to. At our cultural center, we have a display of, they're like little beads in this big old tube, and it's filled up, right? And it was talking, or sharing that before contact, these were all of our Wichita people. And now you go at the other clear tube, and now the beads, they're very small, right? Our tribe is 3,000, what was the number? 674, I wrote it down. So that's how we've been impacted by, you know, colonization, and our, you know, trying to regain our sovereignty, I guess. So anyway, looking at the chart, we see how the nation's impacted the communities, loss of a whole generation of children, negative labeling and stereotyping of community. As we noticed in that first video, we had the youth share about their experiences in education, where they had people telling them to go back to their land to, I don't know, it's just, when we talk about mascots, Atasha mentioned, you know, all these mascots, and I know some people, even tribal people, don't see the hurt that it causes, but whenever I think about people I know who have gone off to college and to different places outside of Oklahoma, in communities where there aren't a lot of Indigenous people, they don't know about Native people. They don't know we still exist sometimes. And they also like have a view of us from what they see on TV, what they see in the mascots, like we're not real, and we're real people. We all have intersecting identities from which we come from in different viewpoints. So thinking about that, so it also affects our community, community disorganization, conflict, social problems, and it goes down to our families. Loss of children, grief, anger, helplessness, family dysfunction, domestic violence, abuse. And then it goes down to that individual. Forced separation from parents, deintegration of identity, suppression of culture, physical and sexual abuse, low self-esteem, mental health problems, difficulty parenting, mental health problems. Yeah, that's all listed on there. And then it talks a little bit about the epigenetic regulation of the HPA axis, which is just I guess a scientific term in the way that our gene expresses within our bodies. And this is like a biological perspective where something that happens to you in your environment, it can express a gene within you and cause you to change in a sense. Think about the lines of like adoption. You know, some people are twins, you know, if they're born twins, but if they grow up in different environments, one can be like really good in band, one might be really good in basketball. They both might have the same set of skills, genetically like made up the same way. But if one was never exposed to playing basketball, one was never exposed to playing band, they don't know that they're able to do these things because of the environment they grow up in. So in the same respect, we look up at our students, they've been told that they can't do these things. They haven't been looked at as people, they're not valued. So they resort to negative behaviors, as opposed to a Native student who might grow up in a community where they're loved, they're cared for, they're listened to, they're exposed to positive experiences. And that's where we see Native people flourish. We have scientists, we have people doing great things in research, medical doctors, actors, models. I mean, there's so many Native people for such a small percentage of this, United States population, or even across the world. There's so many indigenous organizations, indigenous nations worldwide. So that's the important of environment. That's the important of positive experiences for our students. And just keeping in mind that we do not all get that. So it's always important to be mindful how we come at children, how we try to teach them and help them grow. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I believe we have questions. So for our first set of questions, I wanted to reach out to our panelists. And before we even do that, I wanted to, I guess, touch on are land acknowledgements helpful or harmful for Indigenous peoples? I just wanted to speak on that briefly. From my perspective, as a tribal citizen, as an education administrator for my tribe, an advocate for education, I do believe land acknowledgements can be helpful if it's not, I guess, generic, if you're not just saying it to say it, but if you have the history behind it and you are maybe reaching out to the tribal communities from which you are a part of, I think it gives a little history and acknowledgement to those Native people who did live there, and that education portion, right? To just letting people know that we were here, we're still alive, in the respect of the stewards of the land that had encompassed that space from which you are presenting or from which you live. And maybe our panelists might be able to share on that a little bit later if we have time, but I wanted to go into our first question with Chelsea. From your viewpoint, how has the mental health of Indigenous youth been impacted by historical or generational trauma?
Yeah, thank you, Amber. I think the biggest impact that it's had is a lot of times, in my field, in the mental health field, with our SAMHSA grants, is we run into a lot of our youth being raised by grandparents and great grandparents and aunts and uncles and just elders. And when we try to address, the child's mental health, sometimes it's in the best interest of the child if they are sent to maybe a treatment facility. And a lot of times that's an automatic trigger, for some, because you go back to the boarding schools, we're then stripping away the child from their home. So that in itself is a barrier, because we can't even, really help the child if we haven't healed or if we haven't been given the space to heal our generational traumas when it comes to taking the child and stripping the child of their identity and taking them out of the home. It's those impacts are still, very real when it comes to that. And I think that's honestly, the biggest impact.
Yeah, most definitely. I did see a comment in there as well in the Q&A. I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that as well. Let's see. It's Shelly. Oh, okay. She said, are you suggesting that children in school should be evaluated for ACEs? From my perspective, I think at some level, you need to have counselor or mental health available for students. Once we get to Donna's portion in our third objective, because she works a lot in PK through 12 schools, she can share about some of the resources that they have. And ACEs is just an example. I think there were comments about other ways of testing resiliency and things like that. So there's many ways that you can check in with your students or check in even with family members about mental health. But and that's what Chelsea's here for. Chelsea, she works with so many different programs that encompass mental health in so many different areas. So her knowledge here, if you have questions for her in that area, we can ask her on those. But Chelsea, to follow up on what you just answered, do you have any recent examples or real stories that you can share maybe about mental health or about the impact of trauma or generational trauma in ways that maybe you help mitigate or assist someone?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I have a lot of stories, but most recently, like I mentioned before, we have a lot of elders raising our kids and young kids too. I mean, these are kids in middle school and elementary school who are already presenting suicidal ideations at a very early age. It's like it's getting earlier and earlier. And one of the things is we suggested, of course, I'm not a licensed counselor, but there are protocols that we follow where we do contact a licensed therapist and a licensed counselor, and we go through all those protocols. And at the end of those calls, sometimes they suggest that a child goes inpatient for maybe 30 days or sometimes longer, depending on what the child needs. And a lot of times that's an automatic hang up in the face. And in this case, the grandmother, she left. She was not interested in signing the paperwork for the child to be able to go inpatient. And it was a child with suicidal ideations, very heavy suicidal ideations and homicidal ideations. But it puts us it puts not only us in an unsafe situation, but the child in an unsafe situation when our elders haven't healed and they haven't been given that opportunity, like I said, in space to heal. And so without the guardian, our hands are pretty tied. But it's an understandable fear, like I mentioned before, where you're like, okay, well, no, you're either gonna take my child and I'm not gonna get him back, or I'm afraid of what the child may say, and then the child may be taken away for good. And so that's a real fear. And that's our biggest, truly our biggest issue. And that's always most recent, to where, the child will say, well, I don't want to go. And then the guardian in the home will say, okay, you don't have to, and that's, and it's something that we understand and that we face a lot, because we get it. Yeah, generational trauma is very real. And if a child is saying and pleading to their, grandmother who's an elder within the tribe and saying, no, I don't want to go. And then sometimes you can look at them and see like their eyes change, their expressions change. That is very much so like PTSD in a sense. And it's heartbreaking. But it's just, that's our daily that we see. Like I said, like Amber said, I'm over 7 different SAMHSA grants, and sure, we can have cultural classes and things like that to to draw families in and to do a holistic whole family approach. But if we are not helping people heal at the core of the issue and at the core of our existence, and changing some of those and breaking generational curses and healing on a generational level, then this is just going to continue.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I just, before we even go, because I know for time, I'll just go ahead and go to the next question, because there's so much that can be said regarding mental health and the way things impact our people. But we'll go into the next question. What do you think is a practical solution to mental health issues in Indian country?
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of hours that I've prayed for an answer, to this question. And we talk about representation in Hollywood, and we talk about representation, wherever, but we have to have representation in the mental health field. We have to have, Native counselors, Native psychiatrists, those who prescribe medicine to our people. We have to have that. And that's the biggest thing is just representation, because I mean, just imagine, the little girl that's struggling with her self-image, and she goes and her counselor has on a dope ribbon skirt, you know what I mean? Even the ones with pockets, or a young man who's been bullied and someone's cut his hair in the bathroom. What if he goes to his counselor and his psychiatrist walks in as a confident, Native man with a long braid, and that's just, maybe stereotypical, but it's true. When we see people that look like us and we can relate to them on a genetic level, like things change. Even myself, and I like to identify as maybe Afro-Indigenous instead of just mixed. because I identify on both ends. And when I'm seeking a counselor and I'm seeking a psychiatrist for my own mental health and they have a picture, I choose the one that looks like me. Maybe there might be someone else whose credentials might be a little bit better or whatever the case may be. But if they don't look like me, there's no point of me even trying to connect with them on a deeper level, because when you see your counselor and you see your psychiatrist, we're asking our kids and our families to open up on a level and go to depths of their soul that they haven't ever gone before. So imagine doing that, with someone who doesn't look like you, that you can't relate with. It just doesn't work. So I guess, again, to answer your question, just representation in all areas, especially mental health. So if you have anyone out there that is thinking about being a counselor or thinking about being a psychiatrist, like, I pray every day that you finish and you complete your education, so that you can come out here and, join us in the public health field and the mental health field.
Oh, so thanks for those words, Chelsea. You always empower me and lift me up. Love it. We're going to go ahead and go on to the next slide, hit our next objective, because I know we're short on time. So this is understanding the importance of creating strategies to establish and maintain effective relationships between tribal nations and schools in order to collaboratively and effectively meet the needs of American Indian youth. Next slide. All right, so for this portion, I wanted to bring in Donna Ritchie. She was introduced at the beginning as one of our panelists. With that, I do, as I mentioned, work over our education department for the Wichita affiliated tribes. And we do this in partnership with the communities and schools. And we're kind of just here for support and information a majority of time, because Donna's hit the ground running, and she's in the school. She has a team, a staff that help bring into fruition some of our vision and ideas for our Native students. So Donna, if you can kind of explain this here. I chose this one because it was, a one-page infographic, but there's so much that can be said about what has been done. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, Donna, if you want to just share some of your thoughts on this, your experiences, and how it impacts our Native students, the importance of collaboration and community.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Aho, thank you for that. Yes, we are tribal communities in schools, so we are in place in a highly Native populated area as tribal communities in schools, but we are part of an organization, a national organization, and an affiliate called Communities in Schools. And our affiliate is called Communities in Schools of Mid-America. So, I just give great honor to Oklahoma Indian education and all of that history, that you mentioned about how we get our education and improve education for our students, and the historical way that we've gone about that. And now with, OIE, we're able to have these grants that, that come specifically for our students and how we can be effective. So I always give high accolades on NIEA, the National Indian Education Association, for saying, listen, we got a high Native population. We want to try this out. We know this is what the grant says in the objectives, and using that fruition, that diligence to find an organization that does those things. So that can meet the outcomes of those NYCP grants, those ARP grants, ACE grants that we have, and we just added that tribal spin to it and added the cultural relevancy to it and those cultural connections for our students. But we put a person in every single building in Anadarko Public Schools that provide direct services to our students to bring community resources. And community is key. We work a lot with Chelsea in mental health, bringing counselors to students who need it, providing one-on-one support for them, whether it's basic needs and food, or groceries or help, or if it's graduation, requirements. And it's really, our staff really, has those one-to-one relationships with our students, and they're Native. And our staff is Native. If we can't find Native staff, we find someone who is rich in our cultural knowledge in our community. that we know can establish a relationship, with families and parents. But we just bring those community resources, directly to the students so that they're successful. They're graduating from school, they're staying in school, they're getting what they need to do. Does that answer your question, Amber?
Yes, beautifully. So this portion of it, why I bring in Donna is just one way of collaborating, bringing in your tribal communities, bringing in your school community, bringing in the community in which you live, all for the betterment of our youth. Because if they're going to school, a majority of the time they're going to be in that school system. And we talk about representation and how that matters. Seeing someone like them in the school to know that they can talk to, with that program that Donna's over the tribal communities and schools. She talks about holistic approaches to help families. I mean, they've purchased a refrigerator, they've turned on lights, because sometimes when you come from a disadvantaged home, those are real issues that impact you. Those are real issues when you come in to try to learn. Those are real issues that are bothering you. And if those needs aren't being met, sometimes we act out in other ways that may not be beneficial for us and in the future, in the long run. So let's see, I did want to address a question, and I think I want to direct it at Chelsea. So the question is, Indian education and Indian health delivery is complex, with jurisdictions and agencies that can be barriers. What would be the recommendations to integrate systems over time? How can youth be the voice to lead for change?
Absolutely correct. It's extremely complex. With our SAMHSA grant specifically, we're in various counties. So we're located in Anadarko, which is in Caddo County, but we span we span across 7 counties. And so I think that is something that we're also trying to overcome. And one of the things that we have is we have a Circles of Care infrastructure building grant. And what we hope to do with that is to create an infrastructure that we can reach people across jurisdictions, right? And that will also create barriers because not everyone has a phone, not everyone has internet access, but it is a start. There are more tribes and more areas getting, broadband grants and things like that. So we hope that we can start doing things digitally and our people become more comfortable with that. Like, for example, during the pandemic, we would drive, in our cars and set up our hotspots, and people were attending their counseling sessions that way. So hopefully that's something that we can do, is we can just start, going digitally as much as we can, and eliminate those jurisdiction, barriers and things like that. 89 miles. Continue straight.
Yeah, most definitely. Chelsea's out on the road. She's cruising today. Always trying to. And if you know Chelsea or you get to know her, she's a great asset to tribal communities as well as our Anadarko community. And I'm thankful that she's here with us today. Did you want to touch on some more?
Yeah, I'm going to Las Cruces right now. So if there's anyone in the Las Cruces area that want to take me out to dinner and talk about mental health, and I'll be available to eat some chili and stuff like that.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and go on to another question, and I'll direct this one at Donna. What are some working models that you have found to be effective in creating positive outcomes for Indigenous youth and their families?
So just thinking about the models, I'm going to go back to the model that we utilize that, I kind of touched on for this question, and, looking at the model that we have in communities and schools and the way that we have models for providing our Indian education through our different grants and resources. First of all, our nonprofit organization, it isn't specifically a tribal or a Native agency. And so, that they placed us in this population so that, I have, when we're looking at public schools, and especially public schools with high Native population, you've got a staff that doesn't know what they don't know, and they don't know why they need to know it when it comes to Indian students and education. So being able to provide these supports in here, Native supports that we're utilizing Native resources for Native students, has been an effective model. So, you know, I think that model of you know, being able to provide those direct supports and one-on-one, you know, for taking care of food and clothing, and, you know, being able to help students take care of their immediate needs on to more complex one. Our model does this so that teachers can focus on teaching and students can focus on learning. So having those staff in every school site, you know, that's had a direct result of us, you know, increasing our graduation rates. You know, our national average for Native kids to graduate is around 67%, plus or minus. And so, you know, and we've been able to, through our model, you know, bring that to the mid-high 80s for our district, and even around 90% for the specific kids that we work with. That 98% of our students remained in school during the past year. 92% of our students graduated. Over 90% of our students made progress in their goals of areas of academic, behavior, attendance, and social emotional learning, plus the impact that that had on. So being able to use a model that, you know, that utilizes, like, you know, the outcomes of using that holistic approach to teaching, being able to utilize community resources and really bring those resources directly to the students. To me, that has been the most impactful. And the fact that we're able to help with those Indigenous youth is that representation. You know, I heard Tasea mention it, I heard Chelsea mention that representation is so important. So being able to bring programs in where our students are seeing that leadership that looks like them, you know, not only in mental health counselors, but just, you know, being able to in. I'm a product of this district, which is why I have such passion for it. And I can count on one hand, you know, the Indigenous teachers that I had here in Anadarko, where we're, you know, close to, we're 77%, you know, Native students, with about, you know, 39 to 40 tribes that are represented that aren't even original Oklahoma tribes, but just across the nation. So I think that's an important model, that when you can bring the community and the teachers and your Native community together, I think that's so important.
Thank you, Donna. I think we have time for one more question from our panelists before we wrap up. Tasia, I wanted to direct this one at you about Title VI funding for schools. Was previously mentioned. What are tribal consultations, and how do you see them affecting school and tribal community relations?
Absolutely. So under the Every Student Succeeds Act, schools who receive Title VI Indian education funding at a certain threshold, or who have a certain population of Indigenous students in their school, have to consult with tribal nations within a 50-mile radius of their school. So essentially what it is requiring is what, you know, what's happening in some places all along, but it's requiring that conversation and collaboration about how to best serve Indigenous students. It's inviting tribes and tribal education departments and tribal leaders to the table to make sure that our students are being served in the best way possible. So that started in 2016. And actually, that's the year that I became director of our department. And so I have gotten to see it grow over the last 6 years. And, you know, the first year or two, we were all kind of feeling it out. We weren't quite sure what we needed to do or how it was going to work. But over the years now, you know, we've done well over a dozen this year, and with the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and we now are seeing the same people every year in these consultations. So what it looks like a lot of the time is we will go in, we will have administration from the school there, we will have their Indian Ed folks there, and then when our tribal leaders can make it, they show up. If not, they send a delegate. And we basically are given information about how their title funding is being spent, and then we get to give feedback on that. So now, after 6 years of it, we've got relationships that we've built. We know who our contacts are at each of these schools. So if we have a program we want to promote, or if they have they have a student who they know is Potawatomi and they say, how can we help this student? They know who to contact on our end. So it's been a really positive shift, I think, to, at first it was sort of like, we are doing this because we have to. And now I think it's really moving more toward, we're doing this and we see the positive benefits on both sides. So I think there's still a way to go, but I just one, I guess, highlight of a positive example. One of the schools in our area that we work with has a high population of Native students and high population of Potawatomi students. They were using their Title VI Indian Ed funding to pay for some of their administrative staff. And we had been, the other tribes in our area and our tribe had been advocating for a long time that they needed to reallocate that toward a specific Indian Ed person to really focus on some programming for these students. And we felt that was really necessary in that district. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had our consultation for this year, and they've hired somebody, and she's wonderful. And that really did come out of those consultations and that advocacy of, you've got to have someone in here who looks like your students, to Chelsea's point, who they feel comfortable coming to speak to, and who is making sure that your school programming is welcoming and beneficial for Native students. So that's just a little bit about the consultations, but they have been a really, really positive step for making sure our Native students are being served well.
Aho, Tasia. So that kind of wraps it up for our panelist discussion. Some key takeaways to remember, the history has still affects us today through generational trauma, affects our families, the importance of representation, to, have someone there, whatever organization, school, community that you work in, just looking for that Native representation for, the students that you serve, especially our Indigenous communities. I think that's important. And the importance of community and collaborating, whatever that looks like for you. I always see that if people are on the same vision, willing to help and want to I align with your vision, the things that they do. There's so many things that can come from it, so many positive things. So just keep those things in mind. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. I'm gonna turn it over to Deidra.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Tasia. One thing I do want to mention quickly is Donna and Tasia have mentioned some wonderful grants that are offered by the office, through the Office of Indian Ed. If we look on the screen, I just wanted to speak on some terms, and I definitely encourage you to go onto the Office of Indian Education website to look up other additional grant funding that you can bring into your community. These are some of the terms that you may have seen or you may see. The first is OESE is the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. Under that, you will find the Office of Indian Education, the OIE. Also, we have LEA, Local Education Agency. That is your school districts. Whatever your local school district, it is defined as an LEA. We have our state education agency, your state Department of Education. We have TEA, Tribal Education Agency. The difference between a tribal education agency and a tribal education department is generally a tribal code, something that has been written into maybe a constitution or your tribal laws. So those are some of the terms that you may come across. We just wanted to make you aware these are just educational grant terms, federal terminologies. The next slide. We've been very fortunate today to go ahead and answer a few questions as we go. We want to take some time to look in the Q&A box and see if there's anything that we may have missed. And I am not finding anything. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so at this time, I just want to remind you that let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This presentation is brought to you by the Tribal Youth Resource Center. You can find more information on the Tribal Youth Resource Center at www.tribalyouth.org. The Tribal Youth Resource Center is located on 8235 Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood, California. Next slide. This project is supported by a grant awarded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Office of Justice Programs, and the U.S. Department of Justice. This presentation reflects the opinions and conclusions of those who are participating. Next slide. So on behalf, again, of the Tribal Youth Resource Center, we want to thank you for your attendance. We also would like for you to go into the chat box. We offered a link for you to complete a survey and evaluation. By completing this evaluation, it'll help us evaluate our content, and it also will inform us on how we can better serve you in the future. Now, before we leave, of course, this concludes our presentation. However, we know that there has been some sensitive content discussed here. So we encourage you to release that those heavy-weighted feelings that you may have. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We encourage you to watch this meditation video offered by the Muckleshoot language. You don't have to stay through the whole thing, but we definitely encourage you to just release those heavy feelings that you may have. Thank you again for your participation, for those who have questions, and thank you for sitting through our presentation.